Hi, welcome everyone. I'm so glad you could join me this afternoon. This is a presentation on how to recognize and support students with learning disabilities. I'm Megan Trezza. I'm the founder and director of La Jolla Learning Works, and I love this presentation. I've done this many times. It comes from originally my days serving on the local San Diego board of the International Dyslexia Association, where we used to conduct, we call them a walk in a walk in the shoes of someone with learning disabilities, something like that. It was a simulation of what it's like to have learning disabilities. And I have modified and changed and tweaked the presentation over the years to really provide some helpful insight for both parents and educators, not only on what it's like to have a learning disability, but really to help you be able to identify what kind of signs and symptoms you'd be looking for in a child where there would be a learning disability, and then what to do to help and support them. So we're going to be going over all of that this afternoon together. Before we get started, just want to let everyone know I do have everyone's microphones off and videos off because we are recording this so we can share it with people who aren't able to make it here tonight. And we'll also share it with all of you. So if you want to watch again later, you will have it to rewatch, or if you'd like to share it with friends or family, I encourage you to do that as well. I also have a handout that I will be sending out tomorrow or the following day with the video recording and all of our follow-up from this workshop tonight. So I would love for you to take notes tonight. It'd be a good time to pull out some paper and a pen, but just know I'll also follow up with a little handout that will be a good summary of everything we cover today. So let's go ahead and get started here. That was, I guess, my welcome. I just kind of jumped ahead there, but let's go ahead. I just wanted to tell you briefly a little bit about me. So this is me many years back. It seems like a lifetime ago, back when I used to work directly with students. And my role and my background that puts me in this role. So I founded La Jolla Learning Works over 11 years ago. And before that, I had started doing some private tutoring with students coming out of working in reading and kind of early elementary education, and finding that students that I saw had gaps somewhere, something that was just, not working right for them. That wasn't about homework. It wasn't about what, they needed to do for school, but it was about how they approached what they were doing for school, really how to learn. And so I found educational therapy and discovered that as exactly what I was looking for, as how to get at those underlying skills that were getting in the way of a child being able to participate in school at their full potential. And so that brought me to completing a certificate in educational therapy, and then opening up La Jolla Learning Works as a place where I could offer that kind of service with one-on-one attention and really personalized support for families to really help navigate what that whole system looks like when you're supporting a child with a learning difference. And everything from assessment and identification of what exactly is going on, and working with the schools, and then figuring out the right support programs for those children, and then getting at everything else that comes along with it. So helping them prepare for colleges, and getting testing done and all of that sort of thing that comes with whether it's private school admissions or that next step to college. So we now have kind of a full-fledged program that I'm very proud of, and has thankfully been really successful as we've migrated to mostly a virtual situation here since March. But without further ado, I will press on here with tonight's presentation. So our presentation goals, I just did a brief overview of when we just started here, but more specifically, we're going to look today at 3 specific learning challenges. And I choose these because they are honestly the ones that are easiest for me to share with you virtually. But they are just like any of our learning simulations that I do. They give you good insight into what it's like to have a learning challenge, not even necessarily specific to this type of learning challenge, But you'll get a lot out of this, whether or not you're here for a child with an auditory processing disorder, with dyslexia, with executive functioning. Could be something totally different, could be another learning disability or different kind of processing challenge, or maybe it's anxiety or whatever it is. But you will find that as you go through this presentation tonight, there are going to be similarities for sure. And I'd be happy to take questions through the chat box towards the end if there's anything else you'd like me to answer for you. So we're going to cover those areas specifically. And through that, I'll be helping you understand appropriate steps for assessment and intervention to address those challenges. And my hope is that you'll gain some insight and empathy to better support your child. So as we get started here, I just want to give you a little overview of what educational therapy is. I like to differentiate it from tutoring. So I gave you a little opening there about what my story was in coming to La Jolla Learning Works and finding that, tutoring wasn't the thing I wanted to be doing. I didn't want to be sitting next to a child, throughout their education and helping them through their homework. I wanted to be giving them the tools and working on whatever skills they needed to work on so that they could, within a matter of months or perhaps years, get to a point of not needing me. I wanted to work myself out of a job. I wanted to see these kids be able to show up and have their homework done on their own, feel successful going into class, taking tests. You can't bring your tutor with you to school. And I wanted these kids to feel confident going into that classroom on their own. So educational therapy really emphasizes, like I said, the underlying foundational cognitive skills for learning to address what the underlying cause is for an academic difficulty. So that's why we're going to talk about some of these areas today, so you can get a good idea of what that might be. That's that underlying, thing kind of blocking your child, getting in the way of their success. We look at supporting the whole child as an individual, knowing that what you bring to the classroom, what you bring to learning, you have to have this foundation, sleep, some basic needs met, right? Sleep, you have to be well fed, you have to feel comfortable, you have a good shelter, and you have to have your psychological and emotional needs met too. So we look at supporting our students in that way and understanding that there's a little bit of a cyclical thing that happens when you have a learning challenge. It tends to affect you emotionally, psychologically, and sometimes those psychological, emotional problems are more of the origin. They feed into the academic challenges, and then it just creates this cycle. So we always support the student as much as we can, but also with, going outside and connecting with outside resources as well. And then, just adapting our approach for a child's learning style and helping that child understand what their strengths are, what their weaknesses are, how they can better self-advocate and, get what they need out of their learning experiences. And of course, we always collaborate with families and, whatever outside professionals, teachers, because we want to make sure that what we're doing in our sessions really affects a child, in their education all around. And part of this, I wanted to differentiate just accommodation and remediation as far as our approach. We involve both of these aspects into the work we do. A lot of the accommodation side of things is what a teacher could easily do in a classroom, in a group setting. But the remediation is oftentimes what's missed. So the accommodation is essentially where we're looking at, well, this child has a certain learning, challenge, a learning gap, whatever that might be, a learning difference. How can we, change, just, make a modification or a change in the learning setting or the, presentation of the material so that the child can access it. But with remediation, we're actually taking a look to see what is that underlying issue that's getting in the way of the child being able to access the curriculum as it's delivered in a typical classroom setting. And how can we work with that child to strengthen those underlying skills so that we don't necessarily need those accommodations? And so that's really what we do in our learning center, is the remediation side of things. But it doesn't mean that there's any lack of need for the accommodations. But we want to do as much as we can to get at the root causes so that, we're taking whatever there is as a gap between where a child's, kind of grade level class is, functioning, whatever their level of function is, and we want to start closing that gap for them. So that's what we're going to be looking at as we go through each of these areas. I'll be talking about what are accommodations and what are remediations. The areas that we're going to be addressing. So there are some different cognitive functions for learning. This is a simplified view here, but these are honestly some of the most important cognitive functions. And, you know, they affect all different areas of learning, whether you're talking about science or math or reading or writing. All of these come into play in a different way. And the ones we're going to feature today are primarily phonological processing, which is how our brain perceives the sounds in language and is able to then work with them and associate them with their symbolic representation. So we're going to look at that more specifically, but basically it's knowing your letters and your sounds and being able to work with those letters and sounds to read and spell, which is a big deal for everything you're going to do in school. You also have your graphomotor, which we're not going to be touching on today, but graphomotor is your handwriting. It's your ability to connect with then those sounds and symbols and get them onto the page. Or if you're talking about numbers, those numerical symbols, get those onto a page and have that fluency with your writing from more of that motor perspective. Executive functioning we are going to address today, and executive function is what allows a student to execute what's asked of them in a classroom. So to get the work done, to show up, to follow the directions on the assignments, even just to get up, get started, get out the door, get to school on time. So that's a different brain function or set of brain functions that we'll talk about later. Auditory processing is a very fundamental aspect for learning, because a lot of the way that we learn, which you guys are all doing right now, I'm sure you're doing a great job with it, listening to me and being able to not just hear my words, but then process the meaning of what those words are conveying to you. So if you have weaknesses, gaps in auditory processing, it's very challenging to get learning done in a classroom setting when you're listening to a teacher. There's a lot of other kids in the room, noise, that sort of thing happening, or even if you're learning from home and you're dealing with a computer screen and sound issues that could come up, distracting noises. There may be even possibility for more difficulty with auditory processing in our current situation with distance learning. And then lastly, the other area is visual processing. We again aren't going to address that one today, but visual processing would be not just your eyesight and what you can see with your vision, but what happens in your brain with that input that you take in through your eyes, and how does your brain process that. And we use our vision, I'm sure you can imagine right now, for all sorts of different aspects of learning, right? Especially reading, but you know, we're looking at a teacher, we're watching somebody model an example of, you know, how to do something. That's still visual learning. You know, even watching a video is visual learning. So lots of visual processing that happens with learning. There's lots of different aspects to that. So today, just as a little summation here, we're going to go through auditory processing, phonological processing, and executive function. But if you have any questions about anything in these other areas, graphomotor, visual processing, happy to talk to you about that as well too. And like I said, you can enter questions in the chat box that we'll get to at the very end. All right, so let's get started here. First, we're going to talk about auditory processing, which I mentioned is how your brain recognizes and interprets the sounds around you. So not just hearing, but what your brain does with that information that it receives through your ears. And to get started here, we're going to do a little simulation. You're going to listen to a brief part of a lecture. I want you to listen and just kind of think about holding on to the most important parts so I can ask you some questions to get your comprehension on it at the end. Well, let me click here. Let's get us started.
Good morning. How are you? It's been great, hasn't it? I've been blown away by the whole thing. In fact, I'm leaving now. There have been three themes, haven't there, running through the conference, which are relevant to what I want to talk about. One is the extraordinary evidence of human creativity in all of the presentations that we've had and in all the people here. Just the variety of it and the range of it. The second is that it's put us in a place where we have no idea what's going to happen in terms of future. No idea how this may play out. I have an interest in education. Actually, what I find is everybody has an interest in education, don't you? I find this very interesting. If you did it at a dinner party and you say you work in education, actually you're not often at dinner parties, frankly. Sort of thing. if you work in education. You're not asked, you know, and you're never asked back, curiously. But if you are, and you say to somebody, you know, what do you do? And you say you work in education, you can see the blood run from their face. They think, oh my God, you know, why me? It's my one night out all week. But if you ask them about their education, they pin you to the wall. And it's one of those things that goes deep with people. Am I right? Like religion and money and other things. So I have a big interest in education. I think we all do. We have a huge vested interest in it. Partly because it's education that's meant to take us into this future that we can't grasp. If you think of it, children starting school this year will be retiring in 2065. Nobody has a clue, despite all the expertise that's been on parade for the past 4 days, what the world will look like in 5 years' time. And yet we're meant to be educating them from it. So the unpredictability, I think, is extraordinary. And the third part of this is that we've all agreed, nonetheless, on the really extraordinary capacities that children have, their capacities for innovation. I mean, Serena last night was a marvel, wasn't she? Just seeing what she could do. And she's exceptional, but I think she's not, so to speak, exceptional in the whole of childhood. What you have there is a person with extraordinary dedication and found a talent. And my contention is all kids have tremendous talents and we squander them pretty ruthlessly. So I want to talk about education and I want to talk about creativity. My contention is that creativity now is as important in education as literacy. And we should treat it with the same status.
Did anyone feel like that was a lot longer than 3 minutes? I know I did, and I've heard that numerous times. So every time I do that simulation, I sit here and I feel the anxiety. I'm sitting here going like, get me out of here. How fast can this be over? What that simulates is a difficulty with what we'd call foreground and background audio processing. And so we have the crowd noise cranked up so that it rivals Sir Ken Robinson and his TED Talk there. And so it makes it very hard to process and to differentiate and kind of process what he's saying, really focus on him as the speaker and tune out the background noise. So now with that, just want you to challenge yourselves here. Did you get the questions? So the first was, what is the nature of the inherent challenge with education according to Ken Robinson? Give you a second there. Did anyone gather that it was an unpredictable future? Preparing students for an unknown future? Yes, no? It's a hard one. Next was, what does he contend is as important as literacy in education? I'll give you a second to think about it. And I'll tell you, honestly, classroom teachers aren't always so generous with the time. And sometimes it's really tough for students because what happens is the first one shoots up their hand and that's the one who gets called on. And those kids who need a little bit more time to process, they don't ever get called on. They don't ever get to offer a hand because it's already been answered. But the answer here, creativity. So I love this. It's wonderful. It's beautiful because it illustrates for us not just what it's like to have an auditory processing challenge, but what it's like to have any kind of challenge where you're keeping up with you're struggling to keep up with your peers in a classroom setting. So that give you a little bit of an overview here. What you might find in a student if you're looking more specifically for, answering questions of are there issues with auditory processing. Auditory processing has different elements. The foreground background noise is just one facet of it. So you might see a child mispronounce words because they have difficulty with the phonemic awareness, which is the awareness of the sounds in our language and perceiving those auditorily and being able to say a word like spaghetti instead of pischetti, kind of getting those sounds confused or missing a sound in the word, confusing the vowel sounds, that sort of thing. A student who might ask for frequent repetition of questions. So if a question was asked of them what was that question? What did you say? Thinking that they didn't process it fully the first time. Teachers may oftentimes note it as poor listening skills. And you may see that it's a child who you notice can give a right answer when you give them a little bit of a pause, as I was alluding to before. If you give them a little bit of what we call wait time to process what you ask them, they can give you back an answer. And you might just intuitively do that as a parent as you get to know your child. And, teachers or, somebody else who's just getting to know them might not know that. And that would be very frustrating for them. A child like this could appear distracted. You may have noted, like I was saying, how I felt listening to that extremely long 3 minutes, that you would feel, inclined to try to do something else, what's going on in my hand here, picking at my nails, whatever it might be, looking out the window, just trying to relieve yourself of that discomfort. And this kind of difficulty can also align with difficulty with reading and spelling. So we might see that show up academically, in those other areas. So what can you do about it if you have an auditory processing issue? So first of all, with auditory processing, I do want to also mention that an audiologist is somebody who can do a really specific screening evaluation for auditory processing. This is a disorder. I'll just actually go back here for a second. But when you look at these signs, a few of these also overlap an ADHD kind of inattention issue, because you could probably look and feel very distracted if you're experiencing life like that, and you're being asked to sit and focus and listen for extended periods of time. So it's one that can be challenging to kind of tease out from an ADHD, which is where working with an audiologist can be really helpful. Once you tease that out and identify this as a specific disorder area for support, accommodations can be really helpful. Obviously, preferential seating, sitting closer to your audience, in the front of the room where there may be less, distance from the speaker could be helpful. Small group, one-on-one instruction, just to help with like kind of reteaching or giving important instructions. Limiting verbal input, and by that, can be, kind of pausing in between while you're delivering verbal input, making sure that you're also including visuals with any kind of verbal information. And then offering a student lecture notes or a lecture outline that they could keep with them while they're listening to a teacher's lecture. So in college settings, they'll have note takers. I was actually one in college and had a disabled student who asked me to share notes with him. And so that's something you could do after the fact. And when you're working in grade school, you can oftentimes ask teachers if they can share some sort of outline with your student, before they're actually delivering that lecture, and that'd be even more effective. As far as remediation, what we do in our learning center, we work with students on teaching listening and note-taking strategies to actually help them develop better skills for listening. And we do, more explicit spelling instruction for students who have challenges with that phonemic awareness. There's also some different exercises that we can get more specifically from an audiologist that may have evaluated a student. And then, we can work that into our therapy program for them as well. All right, so moving on ahead here, phonological processing, and I felt so lucky to find this perfect image. But basically what this is showing is that with phonological processing, you're talking about hearing a word, seeing a word, and being able to then, kind of mentally in your mind, break that down into distinct sounds and, or put a word together into distinct sounds, being able to associate those sounds with their symbolic representation, which we call letters. So matching words or letters with their sounds, sequencing sounds to make words, that's all part of phonological processing. This is essential for reading and writing, and a deficit in phonological processing is the most common cause of a reading disorder. It's also really one of those identifying factors for dyslexia. There's different types of dyslexia, but this is the most common type of dyslexia, is one that has an impairment in phonological processing. So we do a lot of work with students in our learning center to help support phonological processing. And this is kind of the flip sides of the same coin when it comes to reading and writing, spelling and decoding. Those go on either side of that coin. So we work on them together. Let's take a look though here. So I want to give you a chance to step into the shoes of somebody who has difficulty with phonological processing. And so your instructions here, you're going to read the following passage, and please be prepared to answer discussion questions afterwards. Note the following key, however. When you see this symbol that you may recognize, whoops, sorry, let me go back there. When you see the symbol that you may recognize as an lowercase I, it could make the sound of an I or an E. So try both. If you see this symbol that you know of as a lowercase p, it could make the sound that you're familiar with as a lowercase t or a p for a p. So try them both. You're going to have 1 minute to complete this exercise, and I'm going to start your clock as soon as I flip this slide here. Ready, set, go. If you just happen to join us, we're doing a little simulation of what it's like to read a passage. If you have a phonological processing challenge, should be about close to the end of this passage now. We're going with 15 seconds left here. And then we'll answer a comprehension question. So hopefully you've made it through there. And that's our time. All right, so how was that? Hopefully you got through that passage all right. When we're doing this in a group setting and everybody's sitting around each other, you can see a little bit more of what you might identify as, classroom behaviors, people starting to look at one another's papers, looking at one another, chuckling, laughing, asking to go to the bathroom, all sorts of ways to try and get out of the discomfort. So here, my questions, and you can test yourself. What was the main idea of the passage? And if you're not sure, I'm just going to flip back here real quick. It's animals in tide pools. What are the most common kinds of animals in tide pools? And if you're a good test taker here, you might have inferred it from the third question, but it's invertebrates. What are 3 examples of invertebrates? We can go back here and we'll see if anybody remembers. You have many options to choose from: jellyfish, worms, shrimp, snails, urchins, crabs. So someone shared here, my comprehension is lacking because I was so focused on trying to decode. And I'll just tell you, that's pretty much textbook dyslexia. That would be what a student experiences when they have a decoding challenge. We very often will see students coming into our learning center that are having difficulty with comprehension or reading fluency as the parent concern, and do our assessment and find that it's really not a child who has difficulty with comprehension. It's a child who has an underlying issue with phonological processing and they just can't even decode. But, if you could read a story to them, they could understand it. And, if you can help them to, read and decode the passage, they have no problem understanding it on their own either. So it's very important to get to this as and identify it if it is a root cause. So I will show you next here what some of the signs are. There are a lot, and from my many years working on the Dyslexia Association local board, I've done a lot of work with students that show all sorts of signs like this. And they really, usually a lot of these come up in the history. So, slow to talk, learn new words. That's obviously from the very beginning. We oftentimes see students who have a history of working with a speech language pathologist early on. Difficulty remembering letter names and associated sounds. That would again be, early learning to read. And, I may just say it as, do they struggle learning to read if it's a student that's older and you're remembering back. Difficulty identifying individual sounds in a word or blending, again, another early reading skill. And then as you start to get into like later grades, just identifying poor spelling, having any difficulty with sight words, having inaccurate or slow reading, maybe, complaints of weakness in reading comprehension strategies. And I really spell that out as weak in the reading comprehension strategies, because it's not necessarily that they have weak reading comprehension, but they can't apply strategies because they're so focused on decoding. You see the math start to be an issue when it comes to word problems and reading directions on test questions or homework assignments, which then feeds into poor test performance, which could be because they didn't, read and understand that, social studies textbook passage, or they didn't read and understand the science. So it can then, be across the board. We see, of course, that homework starts to take a lot longer than peers, and that just kind of increases throughout the grades at school. And, again, reading is everywhere. So, it takes them longer to do that. And then all of their assignments take longer. And of course, these are kids that typically don't like to read and, kind of avoid it as much as they can, not their top choice of activities to do. So what do we do to help? Around accommodations for phonological processing, we can ask for tests to be administered orally or given with extended time, knowing that that reading takes a lot longer. We can use spelling correction software, speech to text or text to speech software, audiobooks. So really technology has aided individuals with dyslexia tremendously. And then as far as remediation, we do a ton of this using Orton-Gillingham-based phonological training programs. So lots of big words there. Orton-Gillingham, two individuals, Samuel Orton and Anna Gillingham, they worked together with individuals that really struggled with dyslexia and figured out an approach that works for teaching them. And now there's some wonderful programs that we use. What you see here illustrated with the little magnetic tiles here is part of our program that we use at the Learning Center, the Wilson Reading System. But basically the idea is you work through very systematically and reteaching students, or kind of teaching them for the first time in many cases, what all of our different combinations of letters and sounds are and how to combine those into different words, how to then identify words that are what we call sight words that don't play by those rules, so that they know how to differentiate and then help them apply that for both reading and writing. So that's the general overview. So now we're going to move on here to executive function. Executive function here, this is a really helpful illustration. It really covers, planning, doing, checking, monitoring your actions. It's the high-level cognitive functions that help us decide what activities or tasks to pay attention to and choose to do, including planning and organizing activities, sustaining attention, persisting to complete a task, managing emotions, and monitoring thoughts in order to work efficiently and effectively. So it really does involve a lot of different aspects. You notice emotions are in there too. So we will we'll talk about that as well. First, we're going to do a little simulation. This one goes slowly. It gives you some time in the beginning to read the slides. So just be patient. It's actually going, even though it might not look like it is. I always have to double check myself. Whoops. Let me get that in the right place. There we go. Oh, I should add, don't write anything down, please. All right, did you get the answer? I'm gonna let you guys put it in the chat here just for fun and a little competition. Just enter. Okay, we have a D. I have a D and an A. Anyone else want to submit an answer? Okay, so the answer is actually, drum roll, dun, 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 A. Challenges with this. There are many. Let's just go forward here and talk about this one. That simulation involves a lot of complex thinking. So difficulty with complex academic tasks, like math problem solving is my first bullet point here on executive functioning. So if you think about what you were just asked to do, there's a lot of distracting stimuli, both in the words and having two different, threads that you were following between the sister and her rock collection and the boy and his baseball card collection. And then just the images kind of zooming in, zooming out, things moving across the screen. It's visually distracting too. So not only is it an issue with, processing information, organizing information, holding on to that mentally, but there's also an aspect of, needing to manage your focus too, especially amongst distracting stimuli. So those are different aspects of executive function. It also includes managing time, being able to kind of take a big task and break it down into steps, which can lead to procrastinating to start work or projects without knowing when to start or how to start or having an idea of how much you actually have to do. Difficulty completing the projects, which could be an aspect of, the motivation to, or just kind of that, that self-guidance, what we call metacognition, to help, direct yourself to execute fully through on a task. We see this as, kind of the typical with this graphic here, the disorganization, scattered papers, and now we're seeing it with a lot of students struggling with distance learning and how do you manage things that you can't hold on to. So many different, teachers that have different systems and are all trying to figure out distance learning on their own too. And, that really doesn't help anyone who has any kind of executive function dysfunction to begin with. Forgetting tasks and materials, that sort of thing, just not having a good system for keeping track of things like that. It could be someone who is hyper-focused, anxious, and or easily overwhelmed. So somebody has a hard time kind of shifting their attention from one thing to another. Or again, like thinking about emotional control aspect where, the difficulty with all of these executive functioning skills can actually cause a lot of anxiety. It can also start with anxiety. So it's another one of those kind of like chicken and the egg things that you have to, at least get at it at one place and see how it affects the other. And we think of it as individuals that it can be time challenged, having difficulty having a sense kind of intuitively of the passage of time, of how much time, it takes to do something, having difficulty planning and estimating with time. So these are all areas that we would work with students on to develop good skills for them. And some of the strategies and tools that we would use around accommodations that we ask for at school, teachers to just actually check a student's planner, make sure they have everything written down in it that they need to check. If you're talking about a virtual teaching world, making sure the teacher has clearly communicated, not just orally, but in writing, what's expected of a student, to complete in an assignment, making sure that includes like directions for projects that might be more complicated, and or just a task list of things that need to be done. Just having breaks to recharge, to pause and kind of take a load off and then come back to it, because there's such an element of working memory overload for individuals with executive functioning, processing disorders, and also thinking of the emotional control aspect of it, just kind of relieving the pressure valve, coming right back to a task does a lot to just kind of like refresh and be able to generate, new mental energy for whatever task you need to complete. And then just helping to organize nightly homework tasks and plan for projects and tests. Usually that ends up being an accommodation that parents implement. And we typically take that off of a parent's plate. And then thinking around remediation. So we do a lot of this work at La Jolla Learning Works and the Learning Center, working with students to teach them how to do this stuff for themselves, teaching effective use of calendars, planners, sticky notes, digital tools, whatever it is, to manage, specific tasks. And then helping them with what kind of habits it takes to maintain systems of organization. So not just setting them up, but maintaining them on a regular basis, going through them on a daily basis, going through on a weekly basis, knowing what you need to do daily versus weekly. And especially now, like I said, with the virtual tools. And then helping students to start to identify and express emotions. We use journaling with students. We use what we do as a regular emotional controlled check-in for them, to just kind of help them get to be more aware that their emotions do play into what they're bringing to the table, for whether it's a independent work time for, classwork or schoolwork, or it's, coming to a classroom setting. So that is our executive functioning section. So here's help that really works. I want to just tell you a little bit about what we do for individuals that come to us with, any kind of constellation of these different traits, and others. And first of all, just to emphasize, our approach to this is really that great minds don't think alike. And, what we have in our world is a beautiful, diverse array of brains. And that means that, people do need to learn in different ways, and people do have different strengths. And with that comes that they have different weaknesses too. And so we look to help our students identify both their strengths and their weaknesses, so that we're constantly building confidence and building self-advocacy skills, and, working on that individual as a whole. And I think I appreciate that, from as a parent too, just to think, I look at my child too, and I see, there's things we can work on, but I always want to remind myself of what the strengths are too. And I want my child to be really more aware of their strengths, so that they can follow a path towards those strengths. And then, being able to, work on their areas of weakness as well, with that confidence and what they know that they're good at. So our services, our programs always start with a deep dive to figure out what is really going on. We want to identify which of these different cognitive skills is getting in the way. We do that through assessment. We do assessments in our office on academic skills alone. And then we also do a full psychoeducational evaluation in conjunction with a psychology team. Team of psychologists at Psychology 360 that help us with actually diagnosing learning disabilities and different challenges that could be getting in the way, emotionally, psychologically, behaviorally, that sort of thing. And then we dive in with our educational therapy, addressing reading, writing, mathematics, and executive functioning deficits. We also offer academic coaching to work more specifically on the schoolwork itself, and, subject-specific areas that may be also challenging for a student. We do the test preparation, like I said, and actually this year we also opened up a virtual elementary school. So we have super small classes, personal attention, giving students that opportunity to, get what they need out of a shortened school day, in a group of 4 to 6 students, so that they can have some socialization, but really get the teacher interaction that they need to thrive. And let's see, moving forward. So, what it would look like if you come in to work with us, we start with, an initial call just to understand what you're looking for, make sure you're in the right place. And then you do a personal consultation with me. We sit down, we go through your child's learning history, talk through, what the concerns are, what kind of issues you're seeing, and then decide how to move forward. Many of our clients come, being referred from somebody who just did private testing and directed them to us. So for that, we offer a records review. If you're coming fresh, then we can do assessment for you and help put you in touch with any other, outside referrals you may need. And then we put together an individualized learning plan for each student. Our educational coaches are paired with our students, with the idea of building a longer term relationship. So we always match a student, with an instructor who can work with them on a consistent basis, on a weekly basis. And, we hire experienced educators. Most of our teachers have backgrounds in special education, or more specific content area backgrounds. And then we go through a real extensive training and an ongoing support process with them, because we want to, keep everybody's learning fresh. And we also know that every student is unique and it takes a village. So we worked collaboratively as a team, not just with our instructors, but with parents and outside educators and other supporting professionals as well. And then we have our own system for monitoring progress, collaborating, and making sure that we have thorough communication. With that, our families get regular session reports. We do individualized growth evaluations every 3 months. So we're always working, on top of whatever the current goals are for a student and addressing their needs. And so then just to conclude here, how to support your child to find success in school and enjoyment in learning. So I think parents are the number one best advocates for students. And so, what you can do, I think being here tonight is an amazing start. And I'm sure it's not just the start, it's probably the sign that you're already an amazing parent advocate, just empowering yourself to understand and learn about what kind of differences your child has and what that means for their learning, what that means for their strengths too. Focusing on the areas in greatest need for support. So really like looking at your resources and seeing how you can address those challenges, whether that's by, looking at a different school placement, working with your school for an IEP, or, doing some sort of outside educational support like our program, and also just looking at what kind of assistive technology is out there. So those are amazing advocacy roles that you can play. And I know a lot of parents are doing those and don't realize that they have another, job role that they can add to their resume, and being an advocate. So, recognize you're doing a lot for your kid already, just being here tonight. It's tremendous value for them. And then thinking of you as an ally as well. So everyone needs somebody who's just, got their back, right? So for your kid to know that you are that person, that you've got their back, helping them at home to just, create structured study time, working with them on their schedule, especially for kids with that executive functioning challenge. But creating, a comfortable, productive study space. I know we are all learning so much more about that this year and have ramped it up incredibly with having distance learning situations, but also creating the break time, making sure kids take those breaks, get healthy outlets for, feeling good and getting exercise, moving, being outside, all of the stuff that fuels us to be able to then address our challenges. And then, being that person that notices the growth, that notices the incremental improvements and comments on it. And, thinking of your child, I have it here, when your child is learning to walk and talk, and, how you notice just those literal baby steps, right? And a little step and you fall over, but you're so excited. And we have to think about how we identify those for our children as they're older and they're, facing these challenges on a different level. And then lastly, it's important to just be a parent and, be a source of love and empowerment and joy for your child, and, to create family rituals. I know right now we're all, reinventing our family rituals and maybe having more time for that with less commute time or less time driving around to different practices and after school activities. But thinking of what you can do to, create some rituals for your child to, have calm, to relieve stress, to, see the bright side of things, and to feel a part of a loving family unit when they might be really challenged to find how they belong at school. So that's really my wrap up for you tonight. I have some recommended reading. This will be included in the handout that I'll share tomorrow, or as it may come out the next day when we have the recording of this shared. But there'll be it's a list of books that you can dive into to learn a little bit more about these topics. And lastly, I just want to share, we've been around now for over 11 years as a learning center. And in this time, I've had the tremendous joy of seeing students come to us as elementary school students and, sail off to college and, come back and ask for help with their college application essays. And, we really have been able to see kids turn around, their success story, in the sense that they came in not thinking that they had the capability to be a success story, and they truly became these incredible students with so much resilience, in working through their challenges. So it is so possible, and I think there's just so much potential for students, and that's really what drives my passion for what we do at La Jolla Learning Works. So if you are ready for help, I don't know how many of you are already clients of ours tonight who've joined us, or if you're looking and trying to find some answers right now for challenges you see in your child at home, with working with kids at home right now. I know a lot more parents are seeing things up close and personal in a different sort of way. So if you aren't sure, if you've heard some stuff tonight that sounds familiar to what you're seeing at home and you want a little bit more help or want to bounce some ideas off, contact us. Be happy to chat with you. This is what we do day in, day out at La Jolla Learning Works, and we'd love to help you. So if you do have any questions, feel free to add them in the chat box. We have a few minutes here before we officially wrap up. And if not, then I just want to thank you so much for joining us tonight. And like I said, here's my email address. If you want to reach out separately, feel free to reach out to me, just Megan@ljlearningworks.com. Okay, it looks like we are good on questions. So I will let you guys go enjoy your evening. And again, thank you so much for joining me. It was a pleasure. Appreciate your thank yous. And it's nice to know that this was something really helpful for you. So with heartfelt thank you, good night.